What is up? I'm Harbor Bickmore with Extra Credit Design Club, and today we are going to talk about anatomy of type. Alright, very exciting. So, as I said, in this video, we are going to cover the anatomy of type. We are going to learn what all the parts, pieces, and guides are called when it comes to typefaces, type design. That's a very practical skill, but before we get into the practical knowledge, I want to hit you with a little bit of conceptual framing for why this video is important. So, it's been said, and I believe it, that good design is well considered design. Or if I could say it the other way, well considered design is good design. Maybe you've heard the concept that the opposite of beautiful isn't ugly, the opposite of beautiful is lazy. And it goes kind of along the same line, that when you're trying to produce a good piece of design, you need to consider all of the elements that go into it. If you're designing a chair, you consider how does the leg look, what's the material, what's the grain of the wood, I don't know what else because I've never designed a chair. But I design typefaces, and it's helpful to understand every piece that needs to be considered when designing a typeface. Because not only are you designing an alphabet, you're designing and considering each individual letter. But beyond that, you need to consider each part of each letter. So, in this video, we are going to tell you all the different parts and pieces of type so that you will now, moving forward, be able to take them into consideration. Because well-considered design is good design. So hopefully with that framework, you'll be able to dive into this excited and be able to understand everything that needs to be considered when designing a typeface. Or beyond that, if you're just a graphic designer using typefaces, things to consider when analyzing which typeface to use in your project. Okay, what we have here is the anatomy of type. Wow, very exciting. So let's get into it. So this right here, box key, is a good phrase to explain guidelines in type. You can see that we have 5 guides going behind this phrase. And by the way, if you're wondering, this typeface is called Hidaki. It's available on That Creative. It's a good typeface to explain type design because it has all the parts and pieces we need. Onward. So let's talk about the guides. First one you need to consider is the baseline. This is where all of the letters are going to sit. Now you'll notice here on the little O, it goes below the baseline. The E shoots below the baseline as well. That little part is called overshoot. And in rounded characters, they are going to hang below the baseline and also above the X height. You'll notice here on the E and on the O. So what the X height is, there you have it. It's the height of the X. And this is kind of the guide for where all of the lowercase letters match. A good tip with the X height, if you have 2 different typefaces and you're trying to make them appear the same size, if you can match up their X height, it will be more effective than matching up, for example, the cap height, which might be your tendency. So that brings us to the next part, is the capital height, or cap height as it's generally called. This is how tall the capital letters are. And then moving up, the highest guide is the ascender line. So this is the lowercase letters that have ascenders. This is the line that they reach. Our last guide here is going to be the descender line. So those are our 5 guides. We have baseline, X height, cap height, ascender, and descender. And to remember them all, I'm going to hit you with this little song that I'm about to make up that goes, started from the bottom is the descender, the base, X, cap, and the ascender. It's 5 things. You don't need a song to remember it. Now that we have the guides, let's start talking about all the different pieces of the letters. Right here, we have a character or a glyph. You can use the terms interchangeably. A character is basically any letter, number, punctuation, symbol. Any singular unit in a typeface is called a character or a glyph. Now, the stem. The stem is the basic stroke that makes up a typeface. So right here on the H, for example, we have 2 stems. Onward, we have the serif. The serif is the little stylized little ends of the strokes or the stems in a letter, right? You know, serif, sans serif, serif, what have you. What you might not know about the serif is the bracket. So the bracket is the part of the letter that connects the stem to the serif, the bracket. Moving on, we have the crossbar. This is found in not only the H, but the capital A, lowercase f, lowercase t. And it just basically is a thin stroke that either connects 2 stems or cuts across a stem. Now we have the counter. The counter is the space within the space, the negative space. In an O, or for example in a C, G, C, E, they all have counters. The C, G, C, and E also have aperture. The aperture is the negative space in between the 2 connecting or disconnected portions rather of these letters here. So typeface can have a closed aperture, which is a very small space between these 2 strokes, or it can have a wide aperture. Next, we have the spur. It's kind of like a spur of a boot. We have our little spur on our G. We also have a spur on our lowercase b and sometimes the lowercase q. Next, keeping up with the G, we have the throat of the G. That's the straight part. That's just before that little serif on the bottom of the G. Next, we got the leg. A lot of these be named after human parts. I don't know why, but hey, typefaces as a human experience. So, right here we have the leg. The leg exists on the uppercase R, K, and the lowercase k. Next are the arms. The arms exists on the L, E, F, T, all in capital, and as you can see, they all kind of relate to each other here. The arms. Next, we have the ascender and descender. That's the part of the stem that goes above the X height to reach the ascender, or below the baseline to reach the descender. Next, we have the shoulder. The shoulder is related to the circular shape of the O. However, it is an element that connects a stem to another stem in this arching motif. A shoulder exists not only on the N, the lowercase h, the lowercase r, the lowercase u. All of these have an element of the shoulder. And then next, where the shoulder meets the stroke, that is called the join. Sometimes you'll hear it called the joint, the join, what have you. Next, another human part, we got the spine. The spine exists on the S, capital and lowercase, and also sometimes on the 8. If it's kind of an old style 8, it will also have a spine. Keeping with the S, we have the beak. The beak is a portion that's kind of a serif, but it's kind of an extension of the stroke of the S. That is the beak. Moving forward, we have the tail. The tail really doesn't refer to one specific thing, but rather a fancy little shwoo-hoo-hoo at the end of a letter that isn't something that necessarily is part of the stroke, but an extra little flourish or continuation, if you will. So the most famous tail is that on the Q, but also the lowercase a, oftentimes the lowercase u, and the lowercase t all also have little tails. All right, moving forward, the waist of the B, easy to remember because it's in the middle of the letter. It's the waist, boom. And then the 2 kind of bowls of the B, if you will, are called the lobes. They're different from the bowl, which we'll see later, in that they're not entirely circular, but rather almost like an earlobe shape, just whoop, hanging off there. Something like the D, the capital P, the capital R are all going to have these lobes. As mentioned, the bowls, similar to a lobe, but much more circular in their form here. and these are present on the lowercase b, d, p, q, sometimes the G, depending on the typeface. Next, we have a terminal. A terminal is simply the end of a stroke if it has a little zhizh to it. It's like the end of a stroke with an attitude. So right here on this A, we have a ball terminal. The stroke doesn't just cut off in a blunt end. It has a little like teardrop shape to it. So the end of a stroke is the terminal. Next we have the top of an A is called the apex. The bottom of the V is called the vertex. And then where two pieces meet, that is called the crotch, you know. It's like where your two legs meet, that's your crotch. Same within type design, where these two strokes meet up, that is called the crotch. And then the man of many names, or woman of many names, depending on how you perceive the jot, dot, or tittle. It's got many names. Choose whichever one makes you giggle the most. On to the next. Confusing, because within the E, there's something called the I, and within the I, there's not anything called the I. So, the negative space, or the counter of an E, is called the I. For some reason, it just has its own name, probably because it's such a unique shape, and there definitely is a lot to consider with the shape of your I when designing a typeface, especially because the character E is used so often. That I is really important because you're going to see it over and over again. On to the next one. Now we switched up the typeface here on you. Instead of Hidaki, now we're using this typeface Lastic because the lowercase g in Hidaki is a little too fancy and it doesn't have all the regular parts. So here the lowercase g is very unique in its anatomy, and it starts off with the ear. The ear serves to balance out the weight of the letter. It doesn't seem like a big deal. It seems just like frou-frou fluffy stylization just cuz. But trust me, if you take off the ear of the G, that thing looks like it's going to tip over. And that's meta, cerebral cortex type of stuff. Alright. Next, where the two bowls of the G connect, if you will, that is called the link. Also something that should be well considered when designing a typeface. And then finally, the bottom part of the G is called the loop. So those are the pieces of type. And then we have one more exception that's not a piece of type by nature, and that is the side bearings. So as you are designing type, not only do you need to consider all the parts and pieces, but you need to consider and design how much negative space there are on the right and left of your character. And those are called the right and left side bearing. And in order to achieve a nice, well-balanced, a rhythmic typeface, it's important to really dial down your side bearings and design those very carefully. That's that. Hopefully, with this video, you can take this knowledge and move forward. I know it was a lot to cover, so as a kind gift to you, I made a little something. Sit tight 1 second. Ta-da! In the description of this video, you will find a download link to download this little poster that has all of the anatomy of type, all in one convenient place, right? So you can print it off, put it above your desk, and you can refer to it now and again and really dial in all the parts and pieces of a typeface. On this channel, I personally talk a lot about typeface design. You design alongside with me. I talk about different design genres in typeface design, and I'm constantly referring to the different parts and pieces of the letters. So, if you want to follow along with my videos and not be like, what the heck is this guy talking about? This is the video to watch. And moving forward, I hope it helps you understand type, whether you are looking to design type or just use type in your designs. I hope that this will give you a more considered approach to type design. a more beautiful approach, if you will.